Thank you for taking some time out this afternoon. It's a relatively pleasant afternoon here at Stellafane. I was trying to think, because everybody does this, how long I've been coming to Stellafane, and I think it's 1977, but I did not come every year. Children and other things get in the way in the middle, so. I'm going to talk to you today about this machine. And it's about halfway through its journey to a new observatory. It was built in 1895. I hit right.
Watch out for these bottles.
It's okay. So the telescope was originally in this wonderful building, the McMillan Observatory at Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio, where Mr. McMillan funded its installation. It wound up most recently at this observatory in Tiffin, Ohio, the Ballreich Observatory. Mr. Ballreich is a potato chip magnate, and donated the land and funded the building of this building. Its next location is going to be in Brooklyn, New York, on top of a building owned by Pioneer Works. It's a civic group that does mainly artistic things, but also scientific outreach, and the director of the science part of it decided she wanted an observatory with a classic refractor, because that's what inspired her into going into astronomy at Columbia University. So this is a very nice rendering of what it might actually look like when it's finished. So the telescope will be in the dome, and Manhattan will be visible, and I'm working with them to make sure that we can see out of the dome horizontal, because there's just as many interesting targets on the horizon as there are overhead, and during the day it'd be a wonderful thing to do, look at the Statue of Liberty through the telescope. So you say, why would you put a telescope in a brightly lit area? Well, there's two theories. One is you put the telescope in a dark spot and you get wonderful viewing of dim fuzzy objects. Mario Motta is a proponent of that approach. The other approach is you put the telescope where the people are and you look at the things that you can look at from a bright location, like planets, double stars, other brighter objects, but the magnification of this dims the background and brightens the stars. So this is the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. Their 12-inch Zeiss telescope is the most used telescope in the entire world. Over 4 million people have looked through it. So this is what we have to start with. I have restored a smaller one of these for myself, a 10-inch. And the people that were doing this asked Bart Fried, who's the president of the Anti-Telescope again, to find somebody that could restore it and to put in bids. And I knew how much work it was. It's a lot of work. And you'll see kind of how much work it is. And I'm trying to find less things to do for other people and more things to do for myself. So I put in a slightly higher bid than I might have otherwise, and I was the only person that bid. So now I got to go get it. So this is in Tiffin, Ohio. This is a little bit more about its travels to get to Tiffin, Ohio. It went through the Sandusky Valley Amateur Astronomers, ran it for a while, and it hadn't been used in about since 2012, but it was protected from the weather, sitting under a tarp. There were bats nesting in it, but that was the worst of it. So the lens was in good shape, and the mechanics were all there, but it was rusty. It was beginning to degrade because it hadn't been sort of cleaned and painted in a long time. So my son David, who helps me occasionally with projects like this, as well as my son Aaron, who is here, David helped me pack it up and bring it back to Massachusetts. The telescope has a Brashear photovisual objective with interchangeable front elements. There were originally supposed to be two different front elements, one for visual use and one for photographic use. The color correction's slightly different because the plates are blue sensitive and your eye is more yellow and green sensitive. So it's a very sophisticated lens design. This is a very precise mechanism that allows you to remove and replace the front element. And it's nice because now you can wash the lenses without actually disassembling anything. So the telescope is all there for the most part, and it just needed attention. In this last slide you can see a finder, but that's more of a guide scope. It's like a 4-inch f/15 modern telescope, and we wanted to go more period correct. So another member who was here, an ATS member who was here yesterday, Bob Hamilton, had this 3-inch finder scope made by Fecker. It's the correct one to use as a finder scope. And, oops, I'm pushing too many buttons. There we go. So it has wonderful setting circles, and it has two sets of setting circles, one for mere mortals, and then a silver engraved precision setting circle with magnification and illumination to read to, I think, 10 arc seconds. And it's a very complicated mechanism. You can see that there's a lot going on here. So in order to sort of get it apart safely, we had to disassemble the fine motion controls. The fine motion controls are very complicated affairs. One of the big features that people really like about the Warner and Swasey telescopes is that the controls were at the eyepiece. The fine motion controls and the locks were all at the eyepiece end, so it was very easy to use. Previous telescopes, they had ropes hanging from the motions, and you had to carry the ropes around with you and remember which way to pull which rope. So, but there's a lot of mechanism to do a user interface with gears. It's a lot of work as opposed to an icon on a screen today. So there, you can see there's gears here, there's shafts and universal joints, and this is the tangent arm that actually does the fine motion and declination. And there's a bevel gear set here, and this actually locks the fine motion to the telescope. I built a crate to keep the lens out of harm's way. That's the focuser. That focuser weighs more than most telescopes. It's a 4-inch focuser, all cast bronze. They were showing off. These guys were master builders. They didn't do so well they weren't quite as thoughtful enough with the worm gear for right ascension. It tends to fill up with water and rust. So in order to start taking it apart, we had to we took the counterweights off, we supported the declination axis, and then pointed it straight up and tied it so it wouldn't embarrass us. There's too many cases of the telescope moving around, crashing things while you're fixing it. The bolts that hold the telescope tubes to the cast iron center section were rusted, and we had to painstakingly hammer an Allen wrench into each one of them. So we finally got the tube off, and then, which was a success we celebrated. And then we had to invert the tube without killing ourselves or the telescope, so we tied a long 2x4 to the tube and put a rope on it, took the finder rings off. These are not original finder rings. They're not bad, but this is aluminum, this is brass. I'm making new ones. So we got the rear section off. There's a door on the side of the base pier where you could access the weights that drove the clock, and the wiring had been done on there. We wanted to disconnect it so we didn't rip the wires out when we picked it up. So here's the boom lift coming in, and we're putting a sling on the telescope, the right ascension. So this weighs about a ton, and we had it on the end of the jib section of this telehandler, and took it out, set it down outside so we could do the next piece. But we had a beautiful day, we had some very helpful people, and it went pretty smoothly. This is the base casting, and it turns out this is actually the lightest of those three parts. And we had to go up and over and then load it on a truck. And we drove it back to Waltham, Massachusetts, where I have a shop, and our neighbor came over with his forklift and helped us unload. This is the original clock drive that went missing. It was stolen about 40 years ago, and then anonymously reappeared. And then, so this is going to go back into the telescope. I have to fix that up. So fitting this monster of a telescope into the space I have available is challenging. There's just a lot going on, and these are big, complicated pieces, but all the machinery is of the right vintage to be working on this stuff. There was a little a little wedge driven by bolts back and forth. This is like the micro adjusting of the polar angle. And this is completely hidden when it's together. You don't even know what the extra bolts on this outside of the telescope are for. So you can see things are rusty as I'm starting to take, this is the worm drive apart. And things are rusty, but things are coming apart. The worm gear itself is pretty rusty, but it's coming apart, which is good. And this is what it looks like getting cleaned up. The bronze parts have all been polished. The cast iron housing has been bead blasted. The worm was not able to be saved, so I found a piece of threaded rod on McMaster car. It was the same thread, same pitch. Acme thread, that 29-degree Acme thread. So, and stainless steel this time. So I set up the worm gear, got it running true in my lathe, and then just removed the threaded part and bored out a piece of the threaded rod to match very carefully, put it together with Loctite. It's good for another 100 years. So all of at the time this was made, Warner and Swasey were pioneers. They were founding members of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. They were involved in the standardization of gear teeth and threads and gauging. They were really involved in that transition from craft work to manufactured interchangeable parts, and how do you standardize everything. I gotta go back. I'm trying to go back. Yeah, here we go. So the screws look normal enough, but we don't use this thread system today. All the threads, all the screws under a 1/4 inch are different. The ones 1/4 inch and up are the same as we use today. So those are 3/16 24. They're not 10/24. They didn't have number sizes. They kept going with fractions. So I actually found tap and die for 3/16 24 and had to make a couple of threads. This is the cast iron ring that's been machined, fits in the sheet metal tube. This is the eyepiece end. This is the tube center section. It's a big casting. It's been precisely machined. And this is the declination shaft, which is, it starts with a forging. And these are the declination bearing that are bronze, and there's oil ports everywhere. And there's actually felt in all the holes to hold the oil. So you have to oil this thing maybe every 6 months, a year. That's the declination shaft. It's about 350 pounds. And this is me cleaning one of the 3 bronze rings for the ends of the tube on a probably 1930s South Bend lathe. I think, Mario, you have about the same lathe. So on this telescope, they had sliding shutters to allow air to circulate. And they were painted shut, basically. All but the screws were painted over, and the slides were seized in place by the paint. So we laboriously cleaned out the slots and the screw heads, took it all apart very gingerly. And this it's a steel shutter with a cast iron handle, and this is a cast iron frame that has a little tiny slot machined in it to receive the shutter, but it's too tight. It's perfect if you don't have any paint, but you can't paint the 2 parts and have them go together. So this is, from my telescope, they went to a rotary shutter, which can't get stuck like that. I had to make some new screws, slightly different than what we're used to today, 1/4 22. And basically every screw has to be cleaned, polished, and lacquered. And these are, I built a little turntable so I can lacquer all of these big round parts. This is the focuser casting being polished in my lathe. And it's a little tricky to do, and there it's getting its coat of lacquer. I had to mask off the threads and the bore. I made custom stands for the tube sections. There's a particle board end piece that's attached with screws, and then a little stand so that you can turn this to sand it, prime it, paint it. That's the tube rear section that's all cleaned on its own stand. And then what I did for those shutters is I made bronze shutters and soldered a new little holder, little actuator part to it. So this is just after solder, it's on a hot plate. So you get it hot, hot with a hot plate, and then the flux and solder goes together very nicely. So these are some of the bronze parts starting to look a little better. This is another part of the focuser assembly, and basically I put it in the lathe, polish it, clean it, and true it up a little bit. This is an interesting thing. Again, the machinist at Warner Swasey showing off a little bit. So how do you have like a quick connect for like an eyepiece or a camera or a spectrograph or whatever? So what they did is they made these interrupted threads, and I'll show you the mating pieces in a minute. And then this is a little slot that takes a indexing pin. So you put the pin in here, and then you can turn it like a 1/6 of a turn, and these threads engage. This is the male part. You can see there's that little pin that goes in the slot. And then these are the interrupted male threads that mate with that female section. So it's a very beautiful, highly functional setup, but it's a real pain in the ass to make. But that's the kind of work they did. They weren't afraid to make it as complicated as it needed to be to make it easy to use. So Mario, you would do that, right? So this is the rest of the focuser now cleaned up. I made an adapter. I made this piece that adapts their thread to a Bader click lock adapter that an eyepiece will go in here, modern 2-inch eyepiece. And I like these because it grabs the eyepiece all the way around very firmly. And for a telescope that's going to be used by the public, somebody's going to grab the eyepiece and move the telescope around. And I want a very firm grip. So I've done this on a few old refractors. So this adapter has the Warner and Swasey thread on one side and the C14 thread on the other side. And people, now that you're in the C14 world, you can buy adapters. I decided to show off a little myself, so I decided to make new rosewood knobs for the focuser. And I was doing a little wood turning on my metal lathe. And this is what they look like before they're finished. We had to rebuild the finder because it's actually a brass tube. So I put new crosshairs in it. I had some 44 gauge wire, and that's what the finder looks like, all cleaned and polished, refinished. One of the very interesting things that I decided to do, there's a new gadget that's available. It's not enormously expensive. It's expensive, but it's not astronomical, shall we say. So this is the output end of a fiber laser. There's a optical fiber coming through here and a galvanometer scanner. And this thing puts out 1,500 watts of laser light, CW. And it draws little circles or lines or whatever you want in it. And paint and rust come off in a ball of fire. But when you get down to the bare metal, it just stops. Because the damage threshold for metal is very high. It's conductive, it's shiny. But rust and paint are amenable to being vaporized by a laser. So this is my older son David trying it out. Anyway, it works beautiful, and there's no like toxic slag when you're done. And I don't have to take my telescope. I took the parts to a sandblaster, and it pained me that I had to leave the parts somewhere because there aren't any others. If something happens, you can't replace it. Anyway, this is me and my other son, Aaron, priming the parts. And this is what it looks like coming back together. This is a 3D printed prototype of a finder ring. There's another one that goes here. And it's a little tricky because the tube is tapered. So this section is cylindrical, but the other one is a taper, and the diameter is bigger. So the other finder ring is a little shorter, and the base is a conical section rather than a cylinder. I made new bronze rods here for the counterweights. The original ones were steel. They rust instantly. This is going near the water in New York, not on the water, but close. So I didn't want those rusting right away. And if you paint them, the first time you tighten the screw, the paint chips, and you get a little rust spot. But this is what the whole focuser looks like assembled. It's a thing of beauty. So a month or so ago, I had the local Boston antique telescope guys over. Matt Considine came down from Vermont. This is my friend Owen Gallagher, Roger Sinnott, and Peter Below, and Roger. Yeah, okay. Anyway, everybody came down. We had a good time. We looked at the. It's nice if you're interested in antique telescopes. It's much more interesting to see it in pieces, because then you get to see how it works. That's the objective lens. This is the fine motion control for deck. So, and this is it cleaned up. So you have to take it all apart, clean every piece, and lacquer the bronze bits. And what we do is we use a like a gun blackening process for the steel hardware, keep it from rusting in the future. This is the main casting of the pier. It's about 5 feet tall, and it had been painted 4 or 5 times over the last 130 years. And so this is Aaron stripping the paint, and we do a zinc phosphate prep on top of that. I bought a forklift just for the occasion. And I bought an inflatable paint booth on eBay, and I would highly recommend it. It's like a bouncy house. Comes with the fan, it's like $300, but it keeps all the dust and bugs and everything out of your paint. And that's been working for us. So that's now primed. I'm going to take them up to a body shop I know for the top coat. So this is us taking the declination bearing housing off. The declination bearing housing off the right ascension shaft. And there was a little note from somebody in 1975 when this was last exposed to air. These are the main polar bearings, some shims. And these are the gears that transmit the motion from the fine motion controls around the right ascension axis. Very complicated stuff. This is the bearing housing, that's the thrust bearing, and clearly it's been getting a little wet in there. There's no drain hole at the bottom. These are the anti-friction rollers for the right ascension. It's fantastically smooth moving. The worm gear mounts to this. This is like a lathe cross slide, dovetail lathe cross slide with an adjustable gib. And all that does is hold the worm gear. So this thing, it's just, I understand, you look at a 12-inch job, there's about 12 parts in it. Well, this thing has innumerable parts, and none of them are there because they don't need them. They were just being very thorough. So I think I'm running way ahead on time. It's a complicated restoration, many heavy parts, and you need to keep track of everything. So I've taken thousands of photographs, every single step, because you got to know how to put it back together, where the screws go back, what kind of screw is it. And what I say is every fastener is a little adventure, because the thread sizes are different than we use today. You got to polish it, clean it, and you can't just take one screw out, polish it, clean it, lacquer it, and put it back where it belongs. You got to take several out, sometimes 100, and they can get mixed up. There are a few new parts to be built. Leveling bolts. This thing is being mounted on top of two 82-foot long steel beams that are going to span the building. And I have to figure out exactly how it's going to attach to that, get polar aligned, and perfectly leveled. So I'm working on the design of that. The finder rings are new, and I got to go through the clock drive. When we started the discussion, we didn't know that the clock drive was still available, and then it miraculously turned up. So a new publicly accessible observatory is a good resource for the community, and it's also the best thing to do with a telescope like this, because it does inspire young people. You don't have to explain what end of the telescope to look into. It's exactly what everybody imagines when you say telescope. We went on a tour of Italy with the Antique Telescope Society last fall, and our last stop was a group outside of Milan, Rosano, and it was a civic group that found an antique telescope, restored it to perfection. It's a beautiful thing. It's a 6.5-inch F-18 Merz Dahlmeier. But they built a brand new observatory for the thing. It's like a 30-foot dome. And they just did the most spectacular job of not only restoring the telescope, but giving it a proper place. There's a library, there's a nice history exhibit. They just did a fabulous job, and I'm hoping that's what this happens here. Thank you very much.
question, there's no need to run off to the back of the room.
Yep, Mario?
Can you clean these parts?
Yep.
Okay, it's something I've been asking for a long time. You're gonna lose some material.
Oh.
Put them back together, isn't there space?
No.
How do they fit well?
So the machine surfaces that fit together, yeah, the question is, don't you lose material when you clean the parts? And therefore, it's hard to put back together. The machine surfaces that do go back together, you don't mess with much. You basically clean them lightly. But the surfaces that show the pretty shiny things, you can take 1,000th off, and it doesn't affect anything.
So the machine surface?
The machine surfaces are all preserved precisely, and you'd be amazed how long it takes with a piece of 400 grit paper to take 1,000th off. It's an astonishing amount of work to take 1,000th off. Anybody else?
When do you expect to have them reinstalled?
It was supposed to be December-ish, but the fundraising hasn't caught up with the restoration. So construction is expensive. It's extraordinarily expensive in New York. And doing anything to an old building where they found there wasn't actually a foundation, and they made them remedy that. And then it has to be handicapped accessible. So they put an elevator and external stairs. And just the observatory project is a few million, but to get the building ready for that, they're up to 30 million and counting. New York construction, but there's money in New York.
Did you have to get an architect to approve the plan to put it up on the roof?
Oh, there are many architects, many engineers. Yes, yes.
I have two questions. The first is, did you do anything, what did you do, how did you treat the inside of the tube? Did you do anything special there? And the second question, because you really have my interest piqued, where did the clock drive show up? At your place? Or
No, it showed up at Ohio State. Somebody it appeared at the physics department. The telescope hasn't been there for 40 years.
They knew about the project and it just showed up after the project?
Nobody knows.
And what about the inside of the tube?
The inside of the tube, flat black. Yep, it was not badly corroded. It had been flat black. It wasn't, so we cleaned up the loose, rusty stuff and painted it flat black. It's well baffled.
No Vanta black, right?
No,
So on the other side, Clint has got his hand up.
sure.
Looked like that polar axe bearing, past bearing. You didn't have to recast that?
No, it has approximately zero wear. There are shims, and we could take a shim out if need be, but if it's used, it might go around 10 revolutions in a busy evening, and it's extremely light loading in a lot of area. I've never seen any actual wear on these things. Yes.
I noticed a picture, I think it was the telescope side of the declination axis. It looked like there was a gear that was half a step.
Yes. So those gears that go around the polar axle can't go on over the end. So they're split in two and machined afterwards, and then you assemble them onto the shaft. Very complicated parts. I wouldn't want to make them.
Why do threads like that? Gear went around and threads were.
One of the gears is a sector. It's not a complete circle, and that's because the telescope doesn't go all the way around. You never point the telescope straight down. Yes. Yep.
Yeah, there used to be a Warner Swasey observatory in Cleveland. This passed through there.
So I think that's just a sad story. They just left, and it got run over by weeds and vandals. No, this was never there.
Over here again,
Sure. It's Red Hook. Yeah. I don't know the geography that well, but I will. Yep. Anybody else? Yes.
So is someone else building the dome so it'll be down in the horizon? You'll be able to see all the way down?
Yeah, so it's an ash dome, and myself and Bart Freed and a few others have to make sure that they get the proportions just so that you can see out the slit when the scope is horizontal, so you can look at Manhattan, look at the skyline. And we're also trying to get like the observing chair figured out, because that's a critical piece. And you don't you don't center that base in the dome. It has to be offset in a very particular way. There's a whole bunch of interrelated things that we're trying very hard to teach the architects, that they have to pay attention to these things. I actually had them come up to Harvard to look at the Great Refractor, because I had been telling them on a Zoom meeting, I said, the pier is going to be solid as a rock. They're like, ha, ha, ha. Well, I took them to the Great Refractor at Harvard, and I'm leaning on the pier going through that room underneath the telescope, and I'm saying, you know what this is? They're like, oh, you did say solid as a rock. So it's an interesting journey. There are many interrelated aspects to get this all properly situated. No vibration yet. It took a while to tell them that the telescope has to be mounted independently of the floor, right? Because when you walk, you don't want the telescope going on. So I told them, I said, look, you're going to have a wine and cheese function, dedication of the telescope, and some very important person is going to be looking through the telescope. Who's our friend at the planetarium, the Hayden Planetarium? The physicist.
Oh, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson's going to be looking through the telescope, and you don't want the star wiggling around, because he's going to turn around and say, what idiot put this together?
How about those two beams that the whole thing is mounted on? Are they're to me sound like the weak link.
They are sufficiently strong, but it's a resonator.
What's a resonator?
It's a resonator. It's a spring and a mass. So I've been trying. My diplomatic skills may not be up to the challenge. It's not a technical problem. I understand the technology and the resonant frequencies and whatever, but
It's a resonator with different frequencies in different directions.
Yes, the telescope could be doing this or this. If it's doing this, it doesn't matter so much, right? It's angular motions. So we gave him a spec. We said half an arc second looking through the eyepiece along the optical axis of the telescope. We don't want the image of the star deviate more than half an arc second. And they said, well, how many G's is that? And I said, there's no equation to convert that to G's. And they didn't believe me. They just made one up.
Have you thought about active cancellation?
They are working at a tuned mass damper, but that'll only be good for one frequency. And I'm not sure they're good for very small motions, because they have like bearings, right? And it's like, anyway, it'll be an adventure, yes.
There's so much discovery as soon as it's unclean. How does your cost go into your estimate? Is that why you have all these sun televisions?
I knew about how long the other one took. I didn't keep track of the hours, but it was 10 years spread out, hours and days at a time. But so I had an idea, I had a vague idea, because I had been through the whole exact process once before. It's 30% bigger, but 30% in one dimension. It's cube law, right? So it's 1.3 cubed. It's more of everything, but the number of parts is similar.
Just think about it. 3 cubed is 27. Think about the weight.
It's double the weight of a 10-inch.
Any more questions? If not, or anything occurs to you, I'm sure
Yep,
Alan
I'll be
is around, and he will be glad to talk to you.
Yep.
I think you have actually a 10-minute ice cream break
You've got your
between now
gadget, right? Yep.
and Mr. Mitchell's talk coming up soon.